Imagine your wedding night, but instead of privacy, your entire village crowds into the bedroom to watch. This was the brutal reality for medieval couples, where sex wasn't a private act but a legally binding public spectacle. The church, your neighbours, and even your family demanded proof of consummation, bloodied sheets, cries of pain, all to validate a marriage contract. Why did intimacy require an audience? And how did this bizarre ritual shape centuries of control over women's bodies? So before we unpack this true horror story of medieval history, do me a favour, hit that like button if you enjoy these darker dives into history, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Margot's wedding day in 1347 should have been joyful, but as the sun set, fear crept in. Pushed toward the marriage bed by laughing guests, she knew she wasn't just sleeping with her new husband, she was performing for the entire village. This was the bedding ceremony, where intimacy became public record. Medieval marriage had nothing to do with love. Land transfers, political alliances, and dowries made weddings business deals needing proof of completion. Families demanded witnesses because consummation legally sealed the contract. If Margot's husband didn't take her virginity publicly, either party could back out, and she'd be ruined. The church amplified the horror. Clergy stood among the gawking crowd, judging the act as Margot's husband pushed inside her. Her pain wasn't private agony, but required evidence. Blood on the sheets meant legitimacy. Moans meant compliance. Thomas Aquinas wrote that sex existed solely for procreation, calling pleasure a dangerous distraction. Women who seemed to enjoy it risked accusations of witchcraft. No proof meant disaster. Records from 12th century France describe brides beaten by their families when their hymens didn't tear. In 1382, one English marriage was annulled because the groom failed to perform, even though he insisted they'd had sex privately. Without witnesses, it didn't count. The ritual wasn't about morality, it enforced control. A publicly verified virgin bride ensured heirs were legitimate, protecting property lines. Men inherited titles through wives' uncontested wombs. Women's bodies became ledgers where power was recorded. But the humiliation didn't end with the bedding. After consummation, newlyweds often had to host guests for days while conception was monitored. In some regions, elders inspected the bride's body for signs of resistance, which could prove the marriage unconsummated. By reducing sex to a legal checkbox, the ceremony stripped women of dignity. Their pain was currency, their pleasure irrelevant. And this was just the beginning, because once the church controlled the wedding night, it came for every other intimate moment. Sex was forbidden on Sundays, feast days, during menstruation, through all of Lent and Advent, while breastfeeding, during pregnancy, and for 40 days after childbirth. This was the medieval reality. Couples had roughly 50 permissible days per year for marital relations. The church didn't just control when people could have sex, but how. Only the missionary position was allowed, as it was believed other positions could lead to excessive pleasure. Surprisingly, theology and medieval medicine directly contradicted each other on reproduction. Medical texts like Tritula claimed women needed orgasms to release seed for conception, while church doctrine declared female pleasure sinful. This contradiction put women in impossible positions, biologically encouraged to seek satisfaction, yet damned for experiencing it. Oral sex carried the penalty of 3 years' penance, considered worse than some violent crimes. Confession manuals reveal how priests interrogated couples about intimate details. The 13th century Summa Confessorum asked husbands if they'd allowed their wives improper liberties during sex. Women were questioned about whether they'd experienced unholy sensations. Birth control methods like withdrawal merited 7 years of fasting as punishment, the same sentence given for manslaughter in some regions. Records from ecclesiastical courts show the chilling consequences. In 1320, a French woman was publicly whipped for confessing she enjoyed sex with her husband. A Florentine merchant spent 5 years building a chapel as penance for having relations during Lent. The church even discouraged kissing too passionately between spouses, calling it the devil's doorway. Yet the strict rules created absurd loopholes. Some couples paid for special dispensations to have sex on holy days. Wealthy families bribed priests to overlook technical violations. The very clergy who condemned pleasure allegedly frequented brothels. London's medieval Bankside district had church-owned stew houses operating under episcopal licences. This system created a climate of constant surveillance where natural urges became potential damnation. Parish priests kept logs tracking married couples' abstinence periods. Neighbours reported suspicious noises through thin cottage walls. The bedroom became another confessional where pleasure equalled guilt and restraint meant salvation. But as strict as these rules were, whispers of rebellion persisted. Beneath the church's rigid control, people found ways to circumvent the prohibition, setting the stage for an underground world of forbidden knowledge and dangerous pleasures. In a dimly lit cottage somewhere in 14th century England, a woman whispers a dangerous recipe to her daughter. She lists herbs in careful measures: pennyroyal for preventing pregnancy, tansy to bring on bleeding, mandrake root for its mysterious power. Each pinch could mean salvation or death. This was the reality of underground contraception in medieval Europe, where women risked burning for a chance to control their own bodies. 1 in 3 medieval women died during or shortly after childbirth, a horrifying statistic that made these risky potions seem worth the gamble. Medical records from the period show women swallowing mixtures of mercury and lead, knowing full well the poison might kill them, but preferring that to another pregnancy. Those who survived multiple childbirths often turned to folk magic, wearing amber necklaces to prevent miscarriage or burying pieces of afterbirth to ensure future fertility. The church called these practices witchcraft, yet couldn't stamp them out. In London, licensed brothels operated with the bishop's tacit approval. Prostitutes wore striped hoods by law and paid taxes to the crown. French towns like Montpellier had municipal stew houses where sex workers submitted to weekly medical exams. Even nuns were known to brew contraceptive potions, recording the recipes in coded manuscripts alongside prayers. Secret knowledge passed between generations of women. Moss and sheepskin served as primitive menstrual pads. Certain positions during sex were rumoured to prevent conception, though discussing them openly meant penance. A woman might pray to St. Margaret for safe delivery while secretly jumping backwards 7 times after intercourse, just in case. The contradictions were everywhere. Church officials condemned pleasure but collected fees from brothels. Midwives delivering babies could be accused of witchcraft for easing labour pains with herbs. The stakes of discovery were horrific. In 1324, a French healer was burned for supplying pennyroyal to noble women. German court records describe women drowned for trying to end pregnancies. Yet the underground network persisted precisely because the alternatives were worse. Social ruin for unmarried mothers, near certain death for those with too many births. This shadow economy revealed an uncomfortable truth. Medieval women weren't passive victims of church doctrine. They schemed, risked, and innovated to carve out pockets of autonomy in a system designed to control them. Their desperation gave birth to Europe's first clandestine birth control networks, run by women for women at mortal risk. And just as church authorities thought they'd eradicated these practices, a new threat emerged that would make contraception look tame by comparison. The medieval bedroom was never truly private, a political space where church, crown, and community battled over bodies. Public bedding ceremonies, forbidden days, and underground contraceptives all served the same purpose: control. Women's pain was currency, their pleasure heretical, their wombs public property. Yet these bizarre practices reveal an enduring truth. The personal has always been political. When 14th century women secretly traded herbs or faked blood-stained sheets, they weren't resisting ancient taboos, they were fighting powers that still dominate debates today. The echoes remain in lawmakers defining legitimate sex, in stigma around reproductive choices, in treating pleasure as dangerous. History reminds us bodily autonomy was never guaranteed, only fought for, often in shadows. The real shock isn't medieval extremism, but how familiar these battles feel. That bedtime story never ended,